Well, Dr. Reid, here we are again for the final installment of Fire in the Night, this series on the Psalms, as we take a psalm that we read in the lectionary for this Sunday, and then you and I pull it apart, talk about it. Really, I ask questions, and you're the expert. You're the psalm answer man, as they would say. Do they call you that at Truett?
No.
Well, I've really enjoyed this series. So, and we have the little, our pregame sessions where we prepare for it, and I've enjoyed that. And thank you again for taking the time to do this and re-educate me on the Psalms. And let's dig in. The Psalm we have for today is Psalm 90. It is divide. It's the lectionary gets out the scalpel and leaves some of the verses, 6 verses, on the cutting room floor. The audacity. Sometimes they do this for reasons of length. Sometimes they do this for other reasons. And I think today it's probably has more to do with the themes than the length of the psalm, but we'll talk about that. But we'll just start by reading the psalm. I'm going to read the whole psalm. So I'm gonna switch it back and forth. I'm gonna show people here on the screen here a second the psalm as you would have read it in church with us, and then I'm gonna skip to Psalm 90, and I pulled it up in a slightly different translation just because that's what my browser just sort of automatically went to. But we can bring up other translations if needed. So, all right, people of St. Albans. Here comes Psalm 90. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Make it a little bigger there for you. Okay. Lord, you have been our refuge from one generation to another. Before the mountains were brought forth, or the land and the earth were born, from age to age you are God. You turn us back to the dust and say, go back, O child of earth. For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. You sweep us away like a dream. We fade away suddenly like the grass. In the morning it is green and flourishes. In the evening it is dried up and withered. So that ends verse 6. So I'm going to switch over here, pick up verse 7 right here. Verse 7, and I'm going to read through verse 12, and then we'll switch back to the lectionary version. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you and our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. And then back to the lectionary, right here with verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long will you tarry? Be gracious to your servants. Satisfy us by your loving kindness in the morning. So shall we rejoice and be glad all the days of our life. Make us glad by the measure of the days that you afflicted us and the years in which we suffered adversity. Show your servants your works and your splendor to their children. May the graciousness of the Lord our God be upon us. Prosper the work of our hands. Prosper our handiwork. Well, there it is.
There it is.
Now, Mr. Psalm Answer Man.
Once again, we have a great psalm. We've talked before about the various books in the Psalter. And in fact, last week, we talked a little bit about this psalm as we were looking at Psalm 99, because this is the first psalm in book 4 of the Psalms. It follows Psalm 88 and 89, which are pretty devastating lament psalms.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that is happening in book 4 is a sort of turning the corner from lament to praise. And this psalm is part of that turning process. Now, scholars have wondered, what type of psalm is this? What literary form? And one of the things we can say in this psalm is it's a communal lament. The lament is not just for an individual or even an individual family, but it's for a whole community. One way to think about this is if we go back to the Dust Bowl. Now, I know none of you were alive during the Dust Bowl, but you can imagine what an agricultural town might do if there's no crops for the span of 3 or 4 years. They're probably going to gather around and pray for rain. And a communal lament is one of those times when something has happened to the whole community, so devastating that they need to ask God to intervene. And this is that type of lament. One can also say that this is a wisdom psalm because the passage will say, teach us to count our days. The passage is going to accent human frailty and human mortality, themes that show up a lot. In fact, one scholar argues that Psalm 90 is really a psalm in conversation with Ecclesiastes 3 and 4, which talks about human mortality.
Mm.
If we look at the heading, one of the things the heading says, it says a tefillah of Moses. Tefillah can mean prayer or praise, but in this case, I think it really talks about a prayer. And one scholar, Rolf Jacobson, argues that this is a prayer for divine wisdom. That is the ability to know how to live one's life given our mortality. Divine mercy, that God would hold us in God's hand as opposed to smack us with God's hand. One almost thinks of the Puritan preacher, sinners in the hand of an angry God.
Jonathan
And
Edwards.
so we need divine mercy. But he also says, and the psalm ends with divine blessing.
Mhm.
So in this regard, we can see this psalm as a prayer. And as we go over the structure, as well as the use of the passage in the Christian lectionary and in religious music, we'll see that Jacobson's probably right. This is a prayer, and it's going to really take us through our paces. Let's take a quick look at the structure. You can see that this is sort of 2 parts, 1 through 12, and then 13 through 17. The 1 through 12 part can be seen as 3 different stanzas. 1 through 3, which is going to talk more about God. Stanzas 2 is going to be 4 through 6, which is going to talk about the human situation. And stanza 3 is going to expand on that. And these 3 stanzas really set up the lament part of the psalm. The final stanza, verses 13 through 17, really sort of turn a corner and now move to a petition of God. And so we're going to move from our lament to petition.
Yep.
Now, we've seen laments before, and one of the things they often do is move from lament or complaint to praise. This time it's going to move from lament to petition. So it's slightly different. Okay, let's sort of hone down and look at the heading. Now, if we wanted to be fancy, we could call this a superscription. In the English Bible, the superscription has no verse. It's set above the passage. In the Hebrew, it is verse 1. The purpose of the superscription, or the heading, is to give the reader some clues about how the poem should be interpreted. And so here we're told that this is a prayer of Moses. We've already talked about what a prayer means, but then it says a man of God. This is an interesting turn of phrase, partly because we know that the label man of God is also going to be used of prophets, especially in the book of Kings. I think of Elijah and Elisha, who are both referred to as men of God. And we're reminded that at the end of Deuteronomy, it says, and there never has been a prophet like Moses, which is a little surprising for us because we often don't think of Moses as a prophet. Then it goes on to say, who talked to God face to face. This will be important because part of what's going on in this passage is it's almost as though the psalmist at the petition level is pleading with God to show divine mercy and divine blessing, much as we'll see in some of the traditions of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that Moses will take on that sort of prophetic intercessory function. And so since we're thinking of this as a prayer of Moses, those things line up.
Yeah, and I think, and just one thing to note as a reader, normally when you're in church, at least in our church, because it's not included as a verse in the psalm, this would never be read. And often, unless you look it up in your Bible, you're not going to see it. But it's sort of one of the major keys to unlock this psalm, because if you think this is just a psalm prayed by some random person, just a generic lament, a generic meditation on the brevity of life, a generic request for redemption and hope in the future, sure, it's meaningful and important. But if you know this is Moses, that adds another layer of meaning. Then you can actually root it in someone's life, understand a little bit more of his perspective. I mean, Moses is a guy that knew great privilege growing up in Pharaoh's court, knew great suffering moving into exile, knew then the joys and trials of leadership and ministry and as a human being, and obviously, talking to God face to face, then also coming down the mountain and dealing with the reality of a stiff-necked people and his own sin and his own ultimate inability to cross into the promised land and all those sorts of things. So knowing that later on, when we get to the part that is cut out, even though this is a communal lament, I mean, so you see his life, but also you have to see him praying on behalf of the people of Israel. When he talks about secret sins, he's saying that for himself, he's saying that for the whole people. I mean, it's just, again, all that to say is this is a long-winded preacher saying, when you know that this is Moses talking, or at least attributed to Moses, that the psalmist here has in mind that man, it adds much more color, depth, complexity to this psalm.
Yes. Picking up on Aaron's observation of the importance of Moses, one of the things you want to keep in mind is where we are in the Psalter. As I said, 88 and 89 really lament the end of the Davidic Empire, the end of the Davidic house. And part of what's going on in 90 is it really doesn't really pick up on David. What it does is it goes back to divine blessing before David.
Mm-hmm.
one commentator, Marvin Tate, makes the analogy. It's as if the psalmist is appealing to apostolic authority
Mhm.
by really sort of jumping over David and going back to Moses, the receiver of the Torah in the first place. And that sort of sets up the way we can hear this text.
Hey, quick question, Steve. Why does it
Yeah.
say from everlasting to everlasting in English above the prayer of Moses? Is that in the Hebrew as well?
No,
Okay. Maybe it's
I don't
just
know
a,
where, I
it
don't know
says
where they
book.
got that.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. Okay. Maybe they just thought that was a nice name for the psalm.
Yeah, yes. And there
Because
is
it's from
that
verse 2.
phrase in the psalm later,
Yeah.
and they just sort of moved it up. Yeah. The passage begins in good theological sense. It begins with God. It testifies to an attribute of God and the function of that attribute and the function of that attribute for a particular group of folks. Okay, let's unpack that. The psalmist uses the divine second person. And the translation has Lord, but I think if we were following for emphasis, it would say you, O Lord.
Mm.
And the use of the divine second person is something we've seen pretty often in the communal conversation. One of the things that happens with the laments is one is able to talk to God in the second person. So you get the you. You, O Lord, have been our refuge. Now, this is a tricky piece of translation. The Hebrew form of the word to be here is a Hebrew perfect. And you're probably thinking, why do I care? Here's why you care. A Hebrew perfect conveys completed action in the past, present, or future tense. So some translations will have, you have been our refuge. Others will say, you are our refuge. Because the Hebrew conveys that God being a refuge is not just something in the past, but is something in the present and in the future.
Hmm.
And so when it says, you are refuge, then we want to think of this as past, present, and future. Notice how it leads into the next line, from one generation to another. The NRSV turns this into all foreverish language, but this from one generation to another is a little closer to the Hebrew here. But the point is that God being a refuge, God being a place. Now, one of the things this did for me, and I think for early Christianity, think about Acts 17:28. In God we live and move and have our being. In some ways, the affirmation in Psalm 99, verse 1, and the affirmation in Acts 17:28 is very similar, even though Acts is somewhat informed by Greek philosophy.
Right. Paul is quoting a Greek poet.
Yes. And what they have in common is an awareness that the sovereignty and omniscience of God is such that it becomes the refuge. Now, part of what it would be worth, because we're not going to be here all night or all morning, we're not going to unpack all of what refuge means. but think of the place where you find your identity. It's easy to miss the impact of this claim, not only for the nature of who God is, but for the nature of who God's people are. If we wanted to use fancy language, our doctrine of God gives us an ecclesiology. How do you know the people of God? They are the people for whom God is their refuge. God is their place. When the psalmist says that God is the place of human habituates in God, this comes close to what you're going to find in Christian Orthodox tradition, that will talk about God as the location as well as God as an entity. So we see that at work here. But now the stanza moves on, and it moves on in the cosmic elements of the divine. The psalmist places this in time, more precisely before time. The word before sets up the time after. The mountains were brought forth. Were brought forth. Part of what happens in the English language is we miss that the Hebrew word yalad, to bring forth, is a verb often used for childbirth. So before the mountains were birthed, or the land and the earth were born, once again, another word for childbirth. Two words for childbirth right next to each other. From age to age, you are God. Part of what you want to understand is, for the psalmist, God gives birth to the mountains. But this becomes important because for many religions around the Hebrews, they would understand the mountains as having been there forever. And so to talk about God birthing the mountains is to talk about God being there before the mountains, but also God in the process of creating the mountains.
Steve, if I can interrupt, just a quick question here. Is it putting too much of a stretch on the text to say that this is kind of a nod to feminine imagery of God, sort of the hen gathering a chick under her wings, that sort of thing? Is that a reasonable thing that the psalmist might be doing here?
I think so. I think they're really talking about God as the mother of creation. Now, the stanza is then going to move on to the affirmation of the stability of the character of God. You are God from age to age. This becomes important because I think part of what the psalmist is arguing against are little g gods who are there for a season and were not there before the mountains. And so, especially if we're going to think of this in a post-exilic period, but during every period they have folks who are doing bad theology, who would talk about a time before God or the limitations of God. And this is really just sort of throwing those out the window.
Well, I mean, I think, and it's important to remember that, because for us, we read this from age to age, you're God. We're so used to have been, to being monotheists. My grandpa, my great grandpa, we've been monotheists for a long time, with this idea of this eternal God who exists before all things and all that. But like you say, in ancient Near Eastern religions, you had lots of stories of lots of different divine beings having sort of soap opera relationships and giving birth to new gods and goddesses. And so the idea that there would be one God was pretty radical, and then this idea that God existed from age to age, from one generation to another, that this is it, and this God has been forever and will be forever, is a new idea to some people in that world.
And it becomes an important idea for Christian orthodoxy. Part of what I look at here is when we think of God, but also when we think of issues of liturgy and faithfulness, those happen over time. Those are not, before there was an iPhone, there was theology.
Amen.
And so often we tend to think of theological categories as only having historical place markers. And the psalmist wants to say, no, we're bigger than this. This is not one of our historical psalms per se. This is a bigger psalm that's going to talk about a God before time and a God that is literally bigger than time. And in verse 4, we're going to move to our second stanza, the one that's going to really lift up human frailty. The first stanza talks about God, a God beyond time, and the second stanza contrasts that with human existence. You turn humans to dust. What? That doesn't sound like Santa Claus doctrine of God to me. You turn.
No, it's like a Harry
humans to
Potter
dust.
spell. When I forget what you said, but it's something you say, and the person just
They're dust. Yes.
it's like what
You
Emperor
turn.
Palpatine can do to you.
Yes. So you turn us back to dust and say, go back, old child of earth. That part of what's going on here is the psalmist is going to use two words for human being, the Ben Adam and Enosh. And the reason the psalmist is using those two different words is so that the listener can hear that every form of human being has this fragility of going back to dust. Whether you're a Ben Adam or whether you're an Enosh, you're still going back to dust. And then it says, for 1,000 years is like a day in your eyes. Yeah, and the text is going to say in your sight. I like in your eyes better, partly because it makes the point that God's eyes are different than our eyes. Our eyes are pretty temporal. And if you're like many of us who have presbyopia, which means as you get old, you need glasses, you know how our eyes are different than God's eyes. And so for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday, a day when it is past, like a watch in the night. One of the things about a watch in the night is it has a clear ending. Notice that the passage then goes on that God's eyes are different than our eyes, and our experience is different because we are swept away like a dream. Dreams are funny things. Now, my guess is all of you have had dreams once or twice. And one of the things that characterizes a dream is you wake up. Human beings are like a dream. We're just temporary. God swept us away. And then the psalmist moves to a metaphor that the psalmist likes. We fade suddenly like grass. Now, one of the things it's going to be important to remember, many of you as members of St. Albans have lived in other parts of the world where nature is not as harsh as it is in Texas. In Texas, your grass does not live if you don't water it. And it may even ask you to feed it and give it some shade. But in the world of the psalmist, grass was pretty temporary. And so the psalmist said, we fade away suddenly like grass. Now, also, I want you to remember that this metaphor is going to show up in Hebrew poetry elsewhere. Think of Isaiah 40, verse 8. The flower fades and the grass withers, but the word of the Lord shall last forever. So grass withering is going to be a pretty common metaphor in biblical poetry to talk about transience. And if you ever forgot to water your lawn for 6 weeks, you would know just how transient your grass will be.
This I think if we were to do a modern translation of the psalm, it would be Kansas's dust in the wind.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's Kansas, right?
That's Kansas.
Okay. Yeah. Most depressing pop song of all time.
Yeah.
All we are is dust in the wind. But that's but you know, they didn't come up with that idea. As you say, that kind of temporary nature of humanity, like grass, like flowers, you know, beautiful for a moment, but then it's gone. This is an ancient idea. This is a biblical idea. We see it here in the Psalm, and it's something that gets repeated in the New Testament as well. It does strike me to be in contrast sometimes to the way Americans see human life, and even American Christians see human life as sort of this victorious. I don't know. It just, this seems very bleak. In a sense, I think it's honest, but I think it's different from how we sort of act like we're going to live forever. I've preached before that there's some titles of books that like purport to, you know, there's no such thing as aging. You know, you're going to be 80 and fabulous and all that sort of stuff. The denial of death, that whole idea of Ernst Becker and all those sorts of things. So this is, you know, this is not living your best life now, it seems to me, Steve.
No, it's not. But part of what's going on here, one of my teachers, Leander Keck, used to say, your cross is only as big as your sin is deep. And we live in a culture that has a pretty thin view of sin. And so I think a pretty small view of the cross.
You don't need a big cross if you're just a minor sinner.
If you're just a minor sinner, you're 10 foot tall
cross.
and bulletproof. You're going to live forever. But the psalmist is much more circumspect. The psalmist is much more aware of human frailty. I'm not going to talk much about divine anger, stanza 3, 7 through 12, but I do want to mention a couple things there. One, it does talk about divine anger, because the divine anger is why we need to talk about God's mercy. For we are brought to an end by God's anger and God's wrath. We're dismayed. You know, we know that for the psalmist, we know our iniquities before us, and I like the language, our secret sins.
Mm-hmm.
There's a passage in I think Numbers. It says your sin will find you out.
Yes.
And in Leviticus, you have a sacrifice that you make for sins you've committed and you didn't know you committed.
That's right.
So it's important that you have these things sort of covered. And in this section, the psalmist is really going to pray for divine mercy because of the awareness of the power of God. One of the tricky things in the 21st century is how to talk about God as omnipotent and not come to terms with the anger and wrath of God. And so this section is an interesting and important section for us to think through theologically. Also, one of the reasons I didn't want to miss this is verse 10. Uh, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Uh, Yet their span is but a toil and trouble. They're soon gone and we fly away. Rolf Jacobson, in his discussion of this passage, says that this may be part of the background of the Gettysburg Address.
Hmm.
When uh, President Lincoln starts talking about 7 years ago, part of he's working with the categories of what is a lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
and he's using biblical categories. Now, ironically here, uh, if we look at archaeology, we find that that wasn't how the average length of people, that was a really good long life. But 40 to 50 would be the average lifespan. But I'll leave that for archaeologists to figure out why that disparity.
And by the way, this also seems to really echo Ecclesiastes, as you said earlier. You know, just the shortness of life, and life is just toil and trouble. I mean, that very much sounds like the writer in Ecclesiastes. And I think, you know, one of the things here that we don't have a lot of like, this is a communal lament, as you said before, and we tend to read it very individualistic. So when we read our secret sins are brought to light and you squish us like a bug is sort of how we hear this, and kind of we hear it through an individualistic lens and a shame lens, like we did bad stuff, we've put it in the closet, when it comes out, God's going to be mad at us and wipe us out. But it's important to remember this is communal, and it is absolutely the case when there is sort of a ongoing pattern of sin in a community, that there will be consequences for that, that, as you say, your sin will find you out. And of course, we believe that God is omnipotent and omnipresent, and so God is in that. How exactly that all works out, it's hard to say, but it's important to remember that this is not like, I saw you do that bad thing once at summer camp and I'm going to squish you. Like, this is a, as you say, communal lament. This is kind of the community's way of oppressing the poor, or the community's way of worshiping false idols, or the community's way of having an unjust economic system which preys on the poorest of the people, corrupt courts, or whatever the case may be. Like, all those sorts of things that the prophets talk about in later times. These are the things that cause lots of suffering, dismay, or whatever. And God does hate those sort of ways communities degrade one another and hurt the vulnerable and all those sorts of things. Those are the kinds of things you would actually want a God who is angry about. You wouldn't want a God that doesn't care when there's injustice and racism and economic depravity and all that sort of stuff.
And what a wonderful season to read this psalm.
Mm-hmm.
In a season of pandemic, a communal lament is probably something we want to think about, because this is not an individual circumstance. This is a worldwide circumstance. And so I think we'll as we move to the next section, we can see how we're going to get at that. Because in a communal lament, the petition is not an individual petition, it is a petition on behalf of a broader community. And let us think of this as a petition for a world in a pandemic. The stanza begins with an imperative. In fact, the stanza has 3 imperatives. Imperatives is just a fancy word for commands.
Yeah, we're like demanding that God do something.
Yes. And so return. Return is a good word. This is also the word turn. This is from the Hebrew word shuv. It means to reorient. So when you ask someone to turn around or to pay attention to you, shuv is what you would use. Return, O Lord. How long? It's interesting, the translation, how long will you tarry? because the will you tarry is not, I don't think is in the Hebrew text. It says, turn, O Lord, how long? And I think it just sort of stops there. But the English translator is sort of adding, will you tarry? Then it goes on, still picking up on that first imperative, be gracious to your servants. Now, I want you to think of servants not as your employees, but the people who are obligated to you. Often because of the history of slavery and chattel slavery, we try to turn every servant into sort of Franny Drescher in the romantic comedy as the nanny. Servant for Hebrew is probably not that enlightenment a sort of thing. Be gracious to your servants. Part of what happens in the process of service is a commitment to, in this case, God, but a commitment that is a holistic commitment. It is not a compartmentalized. I am not a servant of Baylor. I am an employee of Baylor. But a servant of Baylor would be a whole nother thing.
Right.
And
So we
so
think
when
of
he
servants
says,
as like a paid employee that could come and go. They could quit their job. They could ask for a raise. You know, we find them on opair.com or something like that. And that's not what this is talking about. This
That's
is
not what
someone
this-
who belongs to the ruler, the master, the property owner here.
Yeah. And so be gracious to your servants. Then we move to our next imperative. And the next imperative is, oops, I went too fast. The second
This is
imperative is
satisfy
be
us.
gracious. Be gracious. The Hebrew here is nakam. Nakam, this is the word about compassion. This is the word also for repentance. And so return and be gracious are two imperatives that set it up. And then our third imperative is satisfy. Satisfy is an interesting imperative. Especially in the 21st century. Imagine the last time you went to Katie's. I'm assuming y'all have all been to
Katie's Custard.
Katie's Custard.
On Valley Mills Drive.
Yeah. And you got something at Katie's and you had to be careful because you want a sufficient size to satisfy you, but not such a big as to give you a tummy ache. The Hebrew word satisfy is an interesting word, and it appears more in later exilic and post-exilic texts. So they want not only for God to return. When God returns, they want God to be gracious. And when God returns, they want God to satisfy them. You have a nice translation here, with your loving kindness in the morning. I would say your mama bear loyalty in the morning. Now, notice in English, it's a small word. It's a simple so. In Hebrew, it's the word ki, which I would translate as therefore or then we will rejoice and be glad all the days of our life. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is, what is the end or goal of human existence? To love God and to praise God. And so what the psalmist is saying is, when God returns, is gracious and satisfies, it provokes in the human spirit rejoicing and being glad all the days of our life. For indeed, this is what the good life is defined as.
Mm.
But also make glad in the measure that you afflicted us. Now, some of us are going to say, what do you mean God afflicted us? Part of what's going on in the text is it says, if something has happened to you, then God is there. There's a gospel song that says, if anything good happened to you, God did it. And what the gospel song doesn't say, if anything bad happened to you, God did it.
A
But
less popular idea.
That's a less popular idea. But the Psalter is saying, God, we've been buked and we've been scorned. And all we ask is now to be as happy as we were sad when we were buked and scorned.
Now, I know that because James Brown said that. Did someone else say that?
Well, I think the psalmist is saying that.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Make us glad in the measure of the days that you afflicted us.
Yeah.
In the years that we suffered adversity.
And, I think when I read this, often I think about times. So, on an individual and a corporate level, like I think about something like the Civil War in the United States. So that is clearly, and I mean, gosh, Battle Hymn of the Republic clearly talks about the wrath of God, and to have a system. And I just bring this up because continues to be international conversation, and we're living out its impact today. The fact that we had a system where you could legally own another human being, that's a communal thing. We all had to agree on that to make that a reality, and that there was affliction that came from that. On white, on black, and then in a civil war, and then the aftermath of that, and again the effects we have today. So we clearly violated the law of God, the doctrine of God, the idea of the Imago Dei. All that sort of stuff was violated in that, and there was an affliction that came from it, and so that's a communal thing. But I also think about on an individualistic level, almost every person I know who has gone through rehab and gotten sober, part of it was feeling the full weight of their actions, finally bringing them to a place where they wanted to get help finally. So there's this, again, I think our category of affliction is often pretty simplistic and just sort of like an angry parent or teacher who kind of flies off the handle because you left the remote in the couch cushions or something. And it's just not that trite. It's much deeper than that.
Much deeper, yes. And then show your servants your works and the splendor to your children. Here, we're going to get an interesting move. Show your servants your works talks about God's activity. And then in 17, make gracious to the Lord upon us, prosper the work of our hands. So in 16, you're describing God's work. God's work provokes human work. And the human work God is asked to establish. The word translation prosper is a good one. Because this is the word for prosper or establish. One of the things that just thinking about the metaphors we've used so far, we talked about the grass. The grass doesn't prosper. It's green a little while and then it's gone. And so the prospering of the work of our hands, the prospering of our handiwork is seen as an ongoing testimony to the graciousness of God. So in some regards, we can see how this is a divine blessing. Now, let's look at I know we're starting to run into time trouble, but let's look at how this is used in the lectionary. This occurs only once in the Revised Common Lectionary, on the 23rd Sunday after Pentecostal year A. And the first lesson is Deuteronomy 34, 1 through 12. I know as Episcopalians, you all know what that means, but for the Baptists who haven't read their text, this is the death of Moses. And so it makes sense that they would connect the Psalm of Moses, and Psalm 99 is the only psalm where Moses is given credit as the author. And they're going to connect that with the last passage that describes the death of Moses and put those together. Now, one of the things I want you to remember here is that Moses, for all his foibles, when I talked about him as a prophet, he interceded on behalf of the people with God. And the psalmist is doing a similar sort of move here. And so we can see why the connection between Psalm 99 and Deuteronomy 34 would take place. Rolf Jacobson also reminds us of how Psalm 99 not only touched those original hearers, but touched the hymn writer, Isaac Watts. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou our guide while troubles last, and our eternal home. And so we're back at the very beginning of Psalm 99. O Lord, you are our refuge. You are our eternal home. Because in this prayer, we've asked for three things. We have asked for the blessing of God. We've asked for, well, I have these in the wrong order. We asked for the mercy of God, and we've asked for the blessing of God. And these things have been pulled together in the ways in which we as a community lament, and we as a community ask God to heal us as a community. So Psalm 90 is a good introduction to Book 4, but it's also a good introduction for us to think about how we struggle in times of difficulty, whether it be pandemic or something else. So
Amen.
I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think, the Psalms, the fact that they are congregational prayers, I hope as people say this, or maybe you're watching this class and you already said it because you attended our 7:30 or 9 o'clock service, or maybe you will come to our 11:15 after this, or maybe you're just watching this at home some other day of the week. But this gives you great language to pray, dear listener and watcher. Even that in verse 13, how long? That question is so poignant, and I think on everybody's lips right now. How long will we have to deal with this situation economically or politically or in the public health sense or whatever? In your personal life, there's probably something where you're like, how long do I have to put up with this? And this plea that God would satisfy us in the morning with his loving kindness or his steadfast love, or what Steve, you said, the mama bear loyalty, kind of this protective, loving parent who wants to defend you. That you can have both those things at the same time, this understanding that you're kind of in a how long space, but also I know God has got me. And because I think without the ability to hold those two things together, you'd sort of go nuts. And also we have the idea that to some extent, as a Christian, we would say that the answer, how long, gets answered in Jesus Christ. That he's the, there's a Christological thing that we can fall to and run to, because that is the steadfast love of God, and that we can rejoice and be glad all our days.
That's right.
Well, as you nod, I'm looking at the cross on the wall behind you and just thinking that that's a great focal point as we end this series in the Psalms, looking at the one who knew these Psalms, who spoke these Psalms, who sang these Psalms in a congregation, and who quoted them all the time, our Lord Jesus Christ. And I hope that as people have been with us through this series, that they have come to know more words that will help them pray and feel closer to Christ, the one who knows the brevity of human life because he lived it, but also promises us eternal life. So thank you, Dr. Reid, for being part of this series. Thank you for allowing my frequent interrupting questions and for answering them so well. And thank you for reminding me of the Godfather of soul, James Brown, in your quoting, been buked, been scorned, but now we know he just got it from the Psalms.
Yes. Well, thank you. As always, it's a delight to be with you and the good people of St. Albans.
Thank you, Dr. Reid.
Okay.